opportunity to learn more about what we do in the next session. But just to quickly summarize, we host a variety of case competitions throughout the year, and we really focus on professional development and networking opportunities for our students. So my name is Evelyn, and I'm one of the executive directors for this year. So I'm leading our branch along with Mohammed and Rutbek, who you'll meet in the next session. I'm currently a third-year accounting and financial management student, and I used to be the DECA co-president at my high school. I've always competed within the marketing categories, and I've had the opportunity to attend ICDC twice. And with that, I'll let Penny introduce herself a bit more.
Thanks, Evelyn. So hi, my name is Penny, and I'm currently the Vice President of Delegate Development within the UW DECA chapter. And I would just say, similar to Evelyn, I help lead the club in terms of training workshops and helping provide our students with the resources they need to do well in competition. And back in high school, I was the co-president of my school's DECA chapter, and I've attended ICDC once for a written event, but I've competed previously in marketing events and orals categories as well.
Okay, so moving on then, for today's agenda, we'll start with the basics of what a role play structure is and the presentation roadmap, and then we'll be getting into tips for how to really organize your solution and prepare for the competition itself. Finally, after that, we'll be wrapping up with key takeaways and have that open Q&A period. So now I'll be passing it back to Penny, and she'll get us started with the role play structure.
All right, so just getting started here, we're going to break down role play, how it works, and then go into details on each different section, starting with instructions and skills, which are key, even though they're pretty similar if you look at the format of that page. You can't just ignore it because it is crucial to make sure that you do succeed in your role play. Then we'll move into performance indicators, which are the content portion of your role play. And this is where you get most of your score on the judging form. So this is also crucial to making sure that you make it to the next round. And lastly, we'll be walking you through how to analyze a case study situation and how to effectively tackle it and present your solution in the most clear and succinct way. All right, so starting with page 1, this is where you would see your instructions and skills and what's required of you within the role play. So it walks you through what to expect in terms of 21st century skills, performance indicators, and a case study situation. And if it's a team event, you have usually 30 minutes to review, and then 10 minutes if it's an individual event. But it basically breaks down the judging details, the structure of the role play, and how much time you have to prepare. So do make sure that you review that before you start, because you don't want to expect to have more time than you actually do. And then at the bottom of the page, you're always going to see a section that has performance indicators. And this is where you're told exactly what you need to talk about in your presentation. And it's really good to make notes on the case relating to these performance indicators. So you're connecting back these factors to whatever the case study situation is. So you always need to focus on these two things when you're preparing for your event. So make sure you just take a quick skim and write down relevant notes once you get started so you don't lose track of this information. And then moving on to page 2, this is where you see the case study situation. So the first part is always a task summary, including your role and what you're expected to do or who you're going to be when you're talking to that judge. So this is almost like your character. And you don't want to forget who this is, because if you walk into your role play and introduce yourself using a different company than the one that was given, you can get docked some serious marks, and you don't want that. So that's the first part right there. It tells you exactly who you're going to be talking to, who you're going to be acting as in this scenario. And then the second portion is usually details regarding the case itself. So they're going to be starting to talk about the problem you're trying to solve here and giving you some background details on what to expect, what's been going wrong in the past, and hinting at your task. And then the last portion finally is objectives, where they actually walk you through what you need to be doing for solving this case and what the judge is expecting to see from you. And usually when you're talking about the objectives and how to solve them or meet them, that is where the PIs come in, and the structure of the case is basically focused on how to solve those objectives and meet them using the performance indicators.
So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but the roleplay presentation is composed of 4 main sections. So that's the introduction, the main presentation body, conclusion, and then finally the Q&A period. So for today, we'll be walking through each of these sections in a bit more detail and providing guidance and tips on how to really stand out for each of these. So starting with the introduction, this is extremely important because it's really the first impression that you make on that judge. Luckily, it's also one of the easiest sections once you learn how to do it right and like put in the time to practice it. So with the introduction, there are a few components that you always want to make sure to include. So first, you want to greet the judge. So this is pretty simple, just being friendly, asking how they're doing. If this were in person, it kind of involve like shaking their hands and things like that. But right after that, you want to dive into introducing yourself and your role. It's really important to stay in character at all times during the role play, and that starts right at the introduction. So you'll want to introduce your name and kind of remind the judge of the role you're taking on. So in a role play situation, that could be something like the director of finance or the marketing manager. It just really sets the context and kind of reminds them what they're doing for that case. After that, it's always nice to thank the judge just for taking their time. You might know some people who are judging, but like it's a volunteer position and they've dedicated their whole day or multiple days to do this. So just having a nice thank you there is always nice as well. After that, something I suggest doing is summarizing the situation and introducing the performance indicators. So again, this really just sets the context and makes it more clear to the judge what the overall flow of the presentation will be. So for example, on the slide, we've included a really short introduction that just highlights some of these key elements that should be included. So this one includes the name, the role, thanks the judge, and then highlights various performance indicators that will be discussed. Obviously, this is a very quick one that we put on the slide since it's hard to fit more. But ideally, in an actual role play situation, you want to not just list out the performance indicators as they are, because that would be kind of robotic, but if you could kind of group them together or make it flow into more, I guess, realistic sentences, then that's always suggested to do. But again, overall, having a strong introduction will just keep the judge interested and engaged for the rest of the presentation. Okay, so moving on to the main body. As we discussed, performance indicators guide the overall structure of the presentation. And when it comes to the judge rubric, you're scored on each individual PI. We'll go through the rubric a bit later, but every single PI is allocated like 10 marks. So something that we think is really important is to clearly identify it in your presentation. You might have heard this at your school chapters or something like that, but it's common for students to explicitly state the PI before they dive into it. And that just lets the judge know, like, you're starting on like number 3, and then they can kind of follow along and mark accordingly. In terms of the general structure, usually you want to start by defining the performance indicator. So for example, your PI might be something like describe different distribution channels. It would be helpful to start with saying what it actually is and maybe highlighting some of the terms that might be relevant. So in that case, that could be like retailers, middlemen, supply chain, just kind of those terms that aren't your usual layman's terms. Your judge might not even be familiar with the term itself, so it's always kind of helpful to get those definitions and kind of explain what it is to start. The most important thing, though, is connecting it back to the case. A lot of times people get lost really focusing on defining what the PI is, but then it's not relevant to what the solution is. So making sure after you have those explanations that you really take the time to explain it. So with the example I was going with earlier about the distribution channels, it's great to explain it, but then the expectation is that it's relevant to the case. So in that case, it would be like, which one is the best fit for this company and why, and spending most of your time focusing on how it's relevant back to the solution. A few other tips that we have when kind of on this PI section is to try to keep the timing even between them if you can. Just because it comes across as you know what you're talking about, it's kind of obvious to the judge if you spend like 5 minutes on one of them and then kind of rush through the other ones. And again, you're allocated equal marks for each one. So trying to brush up on ones that maybe you're not as familiar with and just making it a stronger PI overall. Another tip that we have is getting creative. So we'll be discussing the diagrams on the next slide, but it's not limited to just that. Something I found is really helpful for people when I was back in high school is talking about like real life trends or what companies are doing. I think that's something that a lot of other competitors won't do, but we kind of get in this mind like because the role play situation is fictional that we can't use anything in the real world. But I think the judges really appreciate it too. So for example, if your company is like an online retailer, you can mention Amazon. Like if Amazon has an initiative that they're doing or they've been known for doing something, like it's a valid competitive analysis to talk about your solution. So now I want to talk about some of the possible visuals that you can use in a presentation. So similar to any presentation at all, having visuals kind of just breaks up what you're talking about and can make you like communicate better and they can really understand what you're saying. So on the slide, we've listed a few examples that can be used in some of the different categories. Obviously, we didn't cover all of the categories here. We won't be walking through every single visual, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the key ones. So a really helpful visual that I think is applicable to a lot of different categories is a timeline. The reason for this is because a lot of cases ask you, like, what's the next course of action, or to like plan a campaign or something like that. So having a visual timeline where you can show like what the benchmarks are for like 1 year or 5 years down the road can really make your role play seem like it's more thought out and it's a more tangible solution for the judge to understand. Besides that, another one that's pretty common is the SWOT analysis. So SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And overall, it just provides like a holistic view of how a company is doing in a particular industry. So that's something that a lot of people, especially kind of in the marketing categories, tend to use. But yeah, it's really dependent on your category. So marketing cases often ask for like promotional campaigns or like design a poster or a website or an app. You don't have to be a great artist, and that's not the expectation, especially given you only have like 10 or 30 minutes to prepare. But it always just kind of breaks up the presentation and shows that you put more thought into it if you can kind of show like, here's like a design of what the website could look like, if that's relevant to your case. Yeah, so with that, I'll pass it back to Penny and she'll continue with the conclusion and Q&A.
Thanks, Evelyn. So we'll just start with a few general tips on how to do your conclusion, because it's something that varies on your style. But the main thing that you should never forget to do is summarize the performance indicators, restate your key recommendations, and your proposed solutions. So the whole point of your judge's evaluation form, the basis is the PI. So you want to remind the judge that throughout your presentation, you addressed all of them, and maybe just rewording them, like Evelyn said earlier, but restating them in the inclusion, that's a good idea. And then once you go into that, just quickly mention your key recommendations after you mention the PIs and how they almost tie to it so it flows better. So follow up your PIs with your key recommendation and just restate that, okay, this is what we're planning to do next. And then often just thank the time of the judge after you're done restating your proposed solutions, and basically be considerate of the fact that the judge is taking their time to listen to you, and try to be genuine as you are wrapping up your presentation, because people notice these things and it does look better if you're genuinely thanking the judge, you're smiling. That's another thing. If you just smile as you're saying this and thanking the judge, it helps create a better impression and shows that you genuinely care about the judge's feelings. And then lastly, once you're done with the thank you, just feel free to ask the judge, like, do you have any questions? And make sure that you do this portion, because there's going to be an awkward transition if you don't, because the judge will have questions for you. So if you end it off by saying, do you have any questions, it helps the conversation flow better, and it just overall helps make your conclusion smoother. So on the side, we also have another example of a potential conclusion. And as you can see, it started off with a list of different PIs. This is an accounting case, so it would be slightly more technical. And after they were done stating the PIs, they moved into how it would be used for the specific project or plan that was mentioned in their case study scenario. Then they move into thanking the judge and ask, basically hinting at, I look forward to taking any questions you may have. That's another way to phrase it if you don't want to ask specifically, do you have any questions? But overall, it walks through exactly what you need to do to conclude and wrap up your presentation smoothly. And next slide, please. Yeah. And then after that, that's where you move into the questions and exit portion of the case study situation. So there's a few different things to keep in mind here, because with Q&A, it's always going to be a different answer for each question, because each person has a different approach when they're thinking through problems. So the one thing you want to do is really take your time and ask for clarification if you need it. Don't feel the need to just jump right in and answer the question as soon as it comes out of the judge's mouth, because yes, you may be nervous, but if you just jump in right away, you may not have had time to process, and then you say something that may not be as best answered for the question specifically as possible. So just take a moment to think through it and then answer the question. And the other thing to keep in mind here is taking that moment really helps you seem more natural and well rehearsed, rather than you're just firing off right away. So if possible, just take a breath and then start talking and answering that question. And the other thing is avoid any contradicting statements you might have made earlier. So throughout your case, you're talking about a variety of things. And if the judge asks you a question and you're answering it directly, saying something against what you said earlier, that makes it look as if you changed your mind and you're not as well prepared as the judge thought you were. So that might help lower your overall impression scores, and we don't want to do that. And then the other thing is, if you're in a case where you're doing it with a team member, try to split the questions equally, because otherwise it looks like one team member might be more prepared than another, and the team will seem unbalanced. And you don't want to do that, again, because it is a team event and it should be 50-50. And the last thing is, you might be tempted to break character or celebrate because you're finally done the stressful portion of the event, but try to wait until you're done and you've left the judging call altogether. So just wait until you've exited the room and then start talking to your partner about how it went, because you don't want the judge to overhear you breaking character, because again, it seems unprofessional. You're just trying to avoid that situation. And I'm going to pass it back to Evelyn now.
Sure, thanks, Kamit. So now that we've gone over kind of the basic structure of what a role play is, we just wanted to go into best practices of how to actually spend your preparation time. So we know that, again, it's pretty short, like 10 minutes or 30 minutes, depending on your category. So these are just a few tips of really how to make the most out of the time that you have. So the first thing is that it's essentially you focus on what the objective of the case actually is. So like I mentioned a bit earlier, it's common for people to focus solely on the PIs and like really just hitting all 5 or 7 of them that there are. But at the end of the day, the solution doesn't actually address the case. So before getting to the performance indicators, figure out what the problem is and figure out what an outline of your solution is. It'll make it a lot more clear if you take the time to do this, again, before jumping to the rest of your presentation. But if you have a clear idea of the solution, it'll also be easier to communicate to the judge. And this is something that you can communicate right at the introduction. So you can kind of give, like, I guess, a bit of like a teaser or like highlight of what your overall solution is. And then again, it'll just make more sense to them as you're going through each of those PIs. The second step after that is to brainstorm the ideas. So now that you know what the overall goal is or what the problem that you're tasked with, spend a few minutes to brainstorm the best approach. One important thing with these role plays is to get creative and have a well thought out solution. Like we mentioned before as well, the judges have been listening to many students present the exact same case. Often it's back to back. So you'll want to make sure that your solution is different and also better than the rest. Oftentimes with role plays, there's kind of one easy answer that pops into your mind immediately, but try to work past that because that's probably the first solution that a bunch of other people have also thought of. One example, when I was back in high school, our case was about like a men's shaving company that wanted to enter the women's market. And when I was sitting there with my partner, everybody around us, we heard, had the exact same solution, which was just like, make the razor pink or make the razor white. But everybody ended up presenting that to the judge and it didn't really stand out because no one else really thought about like the actual build of the razor or like how it could be marketed. And they really just focused on like that one simple aspect. But yeah, once you have an idea of what the problem is and now what the solution is, the next idea is to really build out and flesh out that solution. So the performance indicators often provide a good outline of things that you should be considering and details that you need to be including. I'd recommend to kind of stick to the order of the PIs as they're listed. It just makes it easier for the judge to follow along as they're trying to mark you. But again, if it flows, like if you think it would flow better if you kind of reorganize it, you can feel free to do so, and there's no like hard rule that you have to stick to it. So finally, the last step is to use those last few minutes to prepare and practice. So if you're using visual aids, often you'll have like multiple sheets of paper kind of stacked up. Make sure that they're in the right order because it looks really disorganized if you're trying to like flip through and find the one that you're looking for. If you're in a Teams event, you want to coordinate who's doing what, like who's saying which PI, what the order is, who's doing the introduction, making sure you have that down pat. And finally, make sure to practice the sections that you're not feeling as confident about. Again, you're getting marked on each PI individually, and it kind of sticks out if one PI you have no idea what you're talking about. So make sure to spend more time kind of brushing that up. And I'll now be passing it back to me, and she'll be talking about the judge evaluation form.
Yeah, so just before I get started on that, I just wanted to mention a quick thing about building out your solution for the case. So sometimes you're going to be in a situation where you may not be sure about what solution is the best approach, and you might just be confused on where to start. So a good tip to keep in mind for those kind of situations is quickly go over the PIs on the first page, because oftentimes they're phrased in a way to help lead you towards the solution. So if you start considering those factors, it'll help you make a decision easier. So that's something to keep in mind if you ever do get stuck. And now moving into the judge's evaluation form. So as you can see, most of this is based on the content of your performance indicators. So they do make up 70% of the case, which is why we do want you to focus on meeting these criteria, explaining them to the best of your ability, and tying it back to the case, because that's where most of your points will come from. And the other thing we think you should focus on is there's a bunch of 21st century skills that were mentioned on the first page of the case. But the two main ones we think are the most important here would be communication and overall impression. So communication is key here because regardless of effective reasoning, problem solving, if you're not able to clearly explain your thought process, your logic, and walk the judge through how you got to your solution, it's going to be a struggle for them to see the creativity and your problem solving ability because you weren't able to effectively communicate that. And this also goes towards your overall impression because again, if your communication and your presentation is not clear, the judge might not have the best impression of you. So you want to try to avoid that. And then the problem solving, creativity, and effective reasoning just come in as you're walking through the case and thinking through how you want to approach the situation. It'll be evident through your solutions and the way you present yourself, where your creativity comes in, where you put in that reasoning, and how you work through the problems. So just keep in mind that the majority is content, but overall impression and communication still do matter. It may seem like a small portion, but you want to make sure that you do leave a good impression. It doesn't matter sometimes if your content is up to date, but if you're not able to present yourself in a way where your content is clearly communicated, it doesn't matter because no one understands it anyways, right? So you know the stuff, you know your PIs, you know everything, but you want to make sure that you clearly communicate that and leave the best impression possible. Next slide, please. All right, so just quickly walking through case preparation here. So for individual events, there's a different way you can set up each of your role play papers. So like you can make notes many different ways. This is just one classic way that we recommend doing it. So there's going to be around 5 different PIs. So we recommend dividing the page into 6 different sections. And you can just have a summary at the top of the page so you remember what your role is, what company you're working for, and what your objective or goal is throughout the presentation. So you can refer to it easily because it's at the very top. Then we just recommend spending the rest of the sections on PIs. So you write the PI at the top and make basic notes on defining it, tying it back to the case, and explaining how it ties into your solution. Those are the 3 points you should try to include under each PI so it's easier for your presentation to flow better and make more sense. So it's not just going to be about listing the PI and the explanation. You want to make sure that you really spend a lot of time on that connection, as we mentioned earlier, because that is crucial to the case. Like sometimes you're going to find yourself spending a while trying to explain the PI to the judge. But if you can hear yourself rambling or just going on that one specific topic, try to take a breath and stop and refocus on how that PI ties to the case. So this is for individual events, but then there's also a different scenario for team events. So this would be different because since you're going to be going with a partner, you want to go back and forth instead of having one person talk for long periods of time and then have the other person talk for not so long periods of time. So as you can see, we still have the role, company, and goal at the very top of the page, but this one specifically split up so that one person is introducing the role and company, and then the other person moves right into the PI. So after they move into the first PI, the first person takes it back, and you're just going back and forth explaining PIs, connecting them to the case, and explaining how they tie to your solution. So once you're done going through all of them, if you have space for additional notes, there's an extra box. Feel free to write anything you have. Maybe if you have a planned catchy conclusion or anything you want to remember, add that to that box so that you have a fresh framework in your mind of what to expect when you go forward. And I personally have not actually done a team event, but I have noticed the strategy works very effectively for those who use it. So Evelyn, if you want to speak to that and give examples, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to add on to that, something that my partner and I found really helpful in high school is to have this exact breakdown. So she was always responsible for doing the introduction, and she like had that practice, she had it ready to go. And then I would start with the first PI. So like Puneet said, we would alternate, like I would do number 1 and 3, she would do 2 and 4 and kind of go on that way. And we found it really made it clear to the judge, like when we were transitioning between these PIs. And again, that's really important just because the judging rubric is set up. So like each individual one is marked out of 10. So that's what we found really helpful. And like Panit also mentioned, when it comes to the rubric, like for the teams category, it's really important that you communicate and work well together. And one of the ways we would show that is also coordinating how we answered the Q&A period. So with that, the way we decided to have it is that whenever the judge would ask a question, I would always be responsible for starting like the first half of the answer. So the pressure was on me to kind of like come up with something quick, but then my partner would always back me up afterwards. So after I finished like my initial explanation, she would come in with kind of further explanation in detail. And that allows her to really think through what the question is and come up with like a better answer while I kind of started off. But again, this is not like a requirement. It's just something that we found that worked for us and that well for like a lot of other teams when they're competing. Yeah, so moving on that, we wanted to get into a few role play preparation tips. So we've covered the basics of how to do a role play, what the expectations are, but now we wanted to share tips for success based on our own experiences, as well as what we have learned from leading both at our high school and the university DECA chapters. So the first tip we have is to prepare for the performance indicators. So I know this sounds really simple, but I think this is also one of the most important ways that you can really improve your role play scores. So I didn't know this until like halfway through my journey in high school, but on the DECA Ontario website, there are PDFs available that show you all the possible PIs that you might encounter within your specific category. So it's not even just like marketing, but like if you're in like specifically like marketing management, there will be a PDF that shows you, again, every single performance indicator you could ever possibly get asked. So there are probably like hundreds on there, but if you are really interested in improving your ability to do role plays and your content, what you can do is kind of go through each of these PIs and see like what different categories there are. So for example, the distribution channel thing that I mentioned earlier was specific to marketing. And if you don't know what a distribution channel is, it's hard to really do well on that PI. So we would suggest kind of scanning through, see what different PIs are available. If there's any terms you don't understand, like just Googling it, having a better understanding of what that is. So when you actually enter the role play itself, there's no surprises because everything you could have been able to prepare for. After that, another tip is to review prior role plays. So within your category, see if you can find old role plays from previous years, and you can really just use these as practice to understand the different types of tasks that you might be asked. I found for doing it over like 4 years that a lot of role plays are kind of similar. So it might be like a market entry thing for 2 different companies, but if you've done that prior one before, it really gives you a base to start on the new one. And with doing these prior role plays, it's always helpful to try doing it as if it were real. So giving yourself only 30 minutes to think through the solution and then practice or presenting it right after. Obviously, you can take a more in-depth look afterwards and see like, oh, if I get a similar case again, these are good points that I should mention. But having that practice in really prepares you for that time crunch when it comes to the actual presentation. The third tip after that is to brainstorm visual aids. So like we mentioned and we had on the slide, there are a ton of different visual aids that you might be able to use in your presentation, but getting familiar with the ones that might be helpful in your category. So then again, you can save time when you're actually in the prep session because you already know what to expect. So for example, since I was in the marketing category, I was pretty familiar with making SWOT diagrams. So I'd have a way just to like break the paper in 4, and I knew kind of what each of the boxes should include, and it was faster when I was actually in the presentation. And something else, because I was in marketing, was promotional posters. So just having an idea of how I would break it down and what's an effective way to communicate it on the sheet. So when it actually came to my 30-minute prep time with my partner, we didn't spend a lot of time on that. And we could really focus on making our presentation pop out. And I'll now pass it on to Panit, and she'll go over the other 3 tips that we have.
All right, so the 4th tip that we have here is a bit of a fun one. So it's basically to get creative and find ways to stand out in your role play, because you are competing with other students in the exact same case, and most of the time your content will be similar, so you want to make that lasting impression on that judge. So a few different ways you can do this would just be to stay updated with the news and current trends, and maybe find a way to integrate that into your case and mention it briefly and be like, similar to XYZ company in the news, this company is facing this issue and this is what we think you should do. Because like we've seen how that company handled it on the news and it wasn't so well, so we're going to take a different approach. And making statements like that really help show that you're standing out and have a unique perspective to offer on the case. And the other thing you can possibly do is like learn some catchy quotes. if you find like smart lines or maybe even puns or something to stand out while talking to your judge and presenting your case, it'll help create that lasting impression as well. I once had a friend back in high school who ended up qualifying for ICDC because he sang a song and he had 10 minutes to prepare and somehow he managed to come up with a song. And if any of you are musically inclined, go for it because it really did leave that impression. And honestly, I don't think I've heard of anyone singing a song before, but if anyone has any other tips, do feel free to share with each other and find ways to stand out together as you present. And next would be to rehearse your intro. So one thing you want to make sure is you always want to start off strong and on the right foot when you're starting a role play. So if you take a couple of seconds towards the end of your role play time, just to say your intro out loud and rehearse the phrasing you want to use, practice smiling or shaking hands with a partner if this was in person, it really sets a high bar for the rest of your role play because starting off on the right foot creates a good first impression and that just carries over for the rest of your presentation. And then our last tip we would say is to focus on developing your presentation skills because a lot of this just comes down to practice. So when you're in high school and starting off younger, you don't have as much presentation experience. So just keep rehearsing with different partners, with different people, and taking in any feedback they may have to offer. Every person has a different perspective, so you're bound to get different advice on how to improve. And as you keep practicing, you'll get stronger and stronger and create a better role play situation and scenario analysis each time. And it'll also help you with your delivery. So the whole purpose here is to help create that impression and have it carry through as you're presenting your case to the judge. And so just to quickly summarize what we've talked about in this presentation, we began with understanding the role play structure and walking through how it starts off explaining skills and PIs on the first page, then it moves into your role and objective, provides details, and finally lists what you should be talking about in your presentation at the end. And then we moved into knowing how to format the structure of your role play and how to start off with an intro, focus on the PIs, and lastly make a last conclusion and wrap up by smoothly stating your conclusion with your PIs, and then asking the judge if they have any questions. And that's where your organize the solution piece comes in. And as we move into preparing for your role play, we just gave you a few tips and tricks on how to stand out and different analysis strategies you can use throughout the presentation or the 10-minute, 30-minute prep period to help maximize your time and make the most of it. But overall, what we do think is it comes down to practice, having that confidence as you walk into that room, and making sure that you create a lasting impression, just smiling, finding ways to stand out. All these things make a difference. And we do think with practice over time, any of you guys have the potential to succeed in a role play because it comes down to practice. So Evelyn, if you have anything you want to add before we open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, so just to introduce the Q&A a bit more, again, we kind of tried to keep this presentation short just because we know everyone here has varying levels of experience, you're in different categories, so we wanted to keep more of it into the Q&A session. So as we enter that, feel free to ask about anything that we've discussed today, more about our personal experiences. We're really open to any questions that you may have. So again, I don't want to spend too much time going over what we already did, but yeah, feel free to ask any questions that you have.
Okay, guys. Oh, go ahead.
About that. I was just going to say, I just noticed there's a question in the Q&A box. So was there anything you wanted to say before we moved in, Keaton?
Yeah, I was just going to make all you guys panelists just so you can unmute your mics and turn on your cameras if you want to ask questions that way. Paneet, if you want to answer the first question in the Q&A chat box while I do that, that would be great.
Okay, I'm just going to read it out loud. And Evelyn, if you want to start, go for it. If not, then I'll start.
Sure.
So the question is, what is the most common mistake you think someone makes during a DECA competition?
So I think I mentioned this a bit, but I think one common mistake is just focusing way too much on defining the PI itself and not really focusing on connecting it back to the case. So to provide a bit more context for this, back in high school, I was originally the vice president of kind of the case development part and how to present. And then I guess, overall training. And after that, I was the president. And because we had a couple hundred people in our branch at the time, there's a lot of different practice role plays that I've seen people do. And in my opinion, I think that's something that really stood out to me is when someone would spend 90% of the time just talking about what the term is. But at the end of the day, I have no idea how that connects back to the solution. And so it really didn't add any value of including that besides just like marking a thing off the rubric. And I don't think that's something that the judges give a lot of points to. Because again, the most important thing is taking that knowledge and applying it to the case itself.
Yeah, so just to add on to that, I think you're definitely right about the content piece because I've seen students struggle to make that connection as well. But then there's also a delivery portion. Maybe it was more common within my school, but I noticed it was very clear when you were having a practice role play session with someone and they walked in feeling unconfident. You could tell off the bat that the person didn't have the confidence level or that presence that should have been there. So for me personally, I think seeing that lack of confidence is probably the biggest mistake, because if you walk in and you seem nervous, like it doesn't create the worst impression, but you're not starting off as strong as you could, right? So the first impression is always going to carry throughout the rest, regardless of what it is that you do. So if you focus on creating that and being confident, and just, even if you're not, fake it, smile, and fake that confidence until you make it, because that's literally what it is here. But that confidence is required if you don't want to fail in your role play. So find a way to portray it somehow and have it carry through.
Yeah, so I see the next question in the chat about the razor solution. So again, this is like 4 years ago, but I'll try to say what I do remember that we did discuss. So
wait, sorry to cut you off, Evelyn. Can you just read the question? Because I don't think the attendees can see it.
Okay, sure. So the question was, for the razor solution I mentioned earlier, I guess what was my solution if not just being like pink or white? So to address that, when my partner and I were sitting there, we're both female, so something that I think gave us maybe a bit more of an edge was thinking about what do women actually want from the razor. So we focused more on like what other products do women use with razors. A lot of people like using shaving creams, which men might not use for this particular purpose. So we focused on what they would want that way. And I think the way that we were able to market it was having sort of like a subscription box type thing. I think there's something called Dollar Shave Club, but back at the time, this was not popular. So this is kind of a more new idea that a judge hadn't heard about. So we were focused on really focusing on what women would want when they're also shaving. So coming up with like creams, having like lotion to come after it, and kind of shipping it in one package. I think, so that was one of the years that we qualified for ICBC on that. And we were talking to some of the other people in our group about what their solutions were. And they were all really different as well. So one person, I think it's called like the pink tax or something like that. And it's essentially the concept that women usually have to pay more for their products or something like a razor when essentially it's the same thing as like the male counterpart. And so their solution was really to focus on the charitable aspect of it. So not only are these just selling women's razors, but they're selling it at a lower cost. They're donating part of the proceeds back. They're having like advocacy efforts to work against the fact that this is a thing in our society where women generally pay more for things like that. Again, it's a totally different approach, but just having something that stands out, because the other group spent like their entire 10 minutes just saying, we're going to pick a white razor because we think that that color appeals more to the black razors you sell right now. And obviously there's not a lot to go off for that. So hopefully that answers your question.
I'm just going to read the next one in the Q&A because I think the chat and the Q&A are both going off. So this one's about being stressed. So is there any advice you have for people that may get stressed or nervous on the presentation day? And what's the best piece of advice you've been given when it comes to DECA? I guess I could start with that one and then you could carry on. So I think for stress and nervousness, I have the same issue, and I think it's natural for most people to feel stressed and nervous right before you present because you do want to do well. I would say the main thing to keep in mind is try to almost keep yourself in a box, like put all your character and like your thoughts related to the role play into this box in your head, and remember that you are someone outside of the role play, and just see yourself from like a third person perspective almost. Because if you realize that this is only 10 minutes of your life in a presentation that you're just going to walk away from and go back to living normal life. You're going to realize that eventually you're just going to go back and this isn't as big of a deal as you think it is. So for me, it really helped to just think about it as in, yes, it feels like it's the end of the world, but it's not the end of the world because I have other things to do after this. I'm going to go home. I'm going to eat some pizza. And just remembering that you're a human being for me really helped. And then the other thing is like, I honestly think faking it till you make it works because it works for me every time. Like, you guys probably think I'm super confident right now, but I'm probably not because at the end of the day, we do all have our own insecurities about different things. So just remembering that you're human and faking it is going to give you that boost of confidence. Studies actually show that faking it helps you develop the confidence you need to succeed future on. So that's a great way to tackle stress, I would say. And I need some time to think about the best piece of advice. So Evelyn, if you want to start with your answer.
Sure. So I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is everybody else is also feeling nervous at the exact same time. Like when you're lining up there, like everyone else is also freaking out, even if they don't show it. So never feel like you're the only one. And I think something else that might help to calm your nerves right before the presentation is just think about all the work that you did leading up to it and just have more faith in yourself that you know what you're talking about, spent the time to prepare it, and just trying to sound as confident as you can. That kind of ties into like the fake it as you make it part. But sometimes like the judge won't even know, like they're not necessarily like a huge like marketing or like finance expert. So don't feel like they know everything and don't let that, I guess your like lack of knowledge that you might be feeling make you feel less confident when it comes to presenting.
Honestly, I don't think there's a best piece of advice I can say that I've been given because any advice is appreciated. But for me, the one I guess that stood out to me the most was when I was at ICDC, I got paired with like the trainer for my category was very passionate about psychology. And he explained a lot of different things about presentation techniques that I had no idea of. He changed the way our slides were formatted and explained. He gave us a TED talk that really showed why you should use specific colors, specific fonts. And it's interesting to learn about how much psychology actually goes into human interaction. So that kind of opened my eyes to the fact that there's so many different factors that we don't actually know about that go into judging. And it may not be a conscious choice by the judge, but it is still there because it's human nature. So that kind of made me curious. And I would say the best piece of advice I was given is just kind of explore and learn a little more about the human psychology process behind communication and things like that to help you maximize and use that to your advantage in a role play situation.
Yeah, so I think another question, and again, we're just going to move between the Q&A and the chat because I see that they're coming in for both. But one of the questions is how to practice your like talking or presentation skills beforehand. I think something that we found worked well in our high school is to kind of force people to do like impromptu presentations. So one of the exercises that a lot of people found helpful is if we would have like a random item that no one could see and we would ask for a volunteer to come up and we would just kind of give it to them and they would have like 2 seconds to think about it and then try to sell the item. So obviously this isn't what you'd be doing in DECA, but it forces you to think on the spot and just to kind of convey your ideas even if you don't know and you don't have the time to prepare for it. Really, this is applicable for the Q&A session. Ideally, if you did a great job and you considered a lot of factors, you can kind of expect some of the questions, but a lot of times there's like a curveball, like you can't prepare for it. And with Q&A, you can't just like take another 5-minute pause to like think through your solution. So I think that's something that was helpful. But I guess the most important piece there is having the confidence to do it. Usually at my high school, we broke it down, like we had a different classroom for each different category. So when someone would volunteer, they're presenting in front of like 30 other people. I said we force them, like we don't force everyone to do it. It's a volunteer thing, but I feel like the people who did well were the ones who wanted to engage in that practice because it just forces you to, again, like think about something on the spot and doing it to multiple people. And so when you're doing it just to one judge or to 2 judges, like it's not a big deal. Like it's not a whole thing. It just kind of builds up your confidence that way.
I think honestly, you probably covered it all for that one. I'm gonna go into the next one I see into the Q&A here. So this is probably better, I think, if you take it because it's similar to orals, but when approaching customer service online, what visuals or extensions could be used to enhance the presentation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of them, again, don't feel forced to use a visual if you don't think it's applicable. But if you wanted to, I think obviously it depends on the, but something that comes to mind is perhaps just like visualizing what the website or what the customer interface looks like. So if you're talking about like having like a kind of like a chat box that you're interacting with the customer from, you could just draw like a basic outline of the website, show where that would be, how the whole layout looks like, if there's like a contact box. Just kind of showing that interface is something that's better than kind of just talking for an entire 10 minutes. Like if you're talking about how that would work and if it's something, again, that you can connect to like a website or an app, just drawing it out would help. And again, you don't have to be a great artist. You can just have a box and be like, here's the title, here's where the chat box would go, here's generally what it looks like. It just kind of breaks up the presentation visually.
And then how can you stand out in a recorded DECA roleplay such as the ones we did this year? So I personally think for this one, this is gonna sound kind of obvious, but when you're nervous and in the moment, you might forget. But like looking directly at the camera is gonna make a huge difference, because it's gonna make the judge feel as if they're making that eye contact with you and actually talking to you. But it's difficult because we naturally want to look at the person's face instead. So if you can somehow train your eyes to keep it focused on the camera, I think that makes a big difference in terms of building that connection with the judge. Evelyn, is there anything you want to add for role plays on the recording ones? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. It's hard to do it online since again, it's hard to build that like live connection where you can kind of have that like chit chat at the beginning. But I think what Puneet said is as much as you can do in this situation. Yeah, so even if you have like notes or something, try to focus more on the camera because again, that's what the judge is doing.
Wait, to clarify, we're not doing like a video recording, it's only a voice recording, so you can't like have any type of interaction with your body language or anything like that.
Wow, I didn't realize they didn't keep their cameras on. Oh, that's hard.
Then really make sure like you have varying tones and you can like convey your enthusiasm as much as possible. Like I think consciously before you record, think about like how can I sound engaging, like talk at different paces, have like different pitches. Because if a judge is, it's hard for them to kind of stay concentrated if there's nothing for them to visually look at. So you want to like tell yourself as you're going through the presentation to make sure you have those things just to keep them engaged throughout.
I think just to add on, something you could do is if you listen to any podcasts or any news reports where people are talking about things and focus on the way they're talking, because let's say you have a favorite podcast you listen to, they're going to have a certain tone and pitch or just vary it. So if you can pick up on their talking styles and try to adapt it and learn from it, that'll help you with recording because it is hard to stand out when there is no visuals attached, but having that variance in tone can make a huge difference.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I was just wondering, what should you do when the judge asks you a PI and then you don't know what exactly the PI is?
Yeah, so I think with that, like ideally, if you go through like the PDF, you'll see everything that could be asked. I don't think they've ever had a case off of that. But if you are unprepared for a PI, I think based on the term itself, just try your best. So again, bringing back that distribution channel example, you might not know exactly what it is, but you can kind of piece together just from the words and try to explain it the best that you can. And again, just remember to stay confident because your judge doesn't necessarily know, like they're not an expert on that either. So as long as you have a reasonable explanation, just based again on the terms and trying your best with what you have to work with. And again, you have the case, so you know it's somehow related to that. So even if you don't know exactly what a distribution channel is, if you can get a gist from the term of it, and then you know what the case is asking you to do, you can focus more on the connection to the case and like your solution rather than like spending time having like the perfect definition for it.
Okay.
Yeah, so just to add on, never ignore a performance indicator altogether because each one has its own different section in the rubric. So try your best to even restate it and connect it to the case like Evelyn said, but never just brush over it and just skip it because the judge will notice. I think, do you want to go to the chat next or Q&A? I can't remember which one we went to.
Yeah, we'll kind of just go through it as you see. So I see one of the questions is like, do they have to be presented in order? Definitely not, but make sure if you go out of order, you like very, very clearly define which one you're doing first. Because the judge, I think they usually expect people to go like 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. So if you're starting with something like 3, they might assume that you skipped 1 and 2, unless you very clearly clearly say like, now I'll be addressing this part. So again, I think if you do that, then there's definitely no need to stay in that order.
Okay, I see a question here about tips. So what was the weirdest yet most interesting tip that you were told for presenting DECA cases?
So this isn't a tip for like presenting necessarily. So it kind of goes into like how to manage your nerves beforehand. But there was one team who was in the same category as us. So I saw them a couple years. They would do this like weird chant dance thing like outside before they went into the room because it just like made them feel better. So for the actual presentation itself, it felt more like smooth. Like they were confident, they knew what they were doing because they would have a good laugh before it. I don't know if Puneet, you have anything specifically like during the presentation.
Honestly, I think the weirdest thing I saw was this song because after that happened with my friend where they qualified by singing a song, it like his tip to everybody was to find a way to sing a song, which works for some people, but not always for each one. And I don't have as much experience with cases. Like I have it with writtens, but like if I had to say one thing that I was told that I found really interesting was I was told to make my slides dark wherever possible. So the focus was on us as the presenter and it wouldn't be detracting from what we're saying because sometimes the judge gets focused on the visuals and forgets to look at you, but that's relevant to written. So I'm not sure if that works here.
So I was sent a question privately for you guys. When you were president, what was the best method of practice for your chapter?
Evelyn, you want to go first? I think your chapter was the biggest.
Yeah, sure. So my high school was Glen Forest, and I don't know because unfortunately the branch had to close down a few years ago. But at the time, we had like 200 to 300 students each year who would compete. So what we did is, again, we broke it into the different categories, but generally the tips that we gave to like the VPs who were leading the training sessions was to have a good variety. So yeah, we did have like a few content PowerPoints going through it, but I think we focused more on the actual presentation itself. So we had those impromptu things. Something that we found worked well was having like a Kahoot, because a Kahoot kind of forces you to like quickly recall knowledge. So we would put like key terms or something that you should know. And then having it in like a game session, people were able to like realize which ones they knew, which ones they didn't know, and then work on those specific areas. So it's just a way to cover it broad. I don't know if that addresses the question properly.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna add on because I know when I was president back in high school, we had about 100 students in my chapter, a little over 100. And I think one thing that really helped our students was since a lot of them were new to DECA, each year before the regional competition, we would host what we called like a mock regionals and structure it exactly the same way that the regional competition would have been in person. We created schedules beforehand, we gave them mini little time cards, and we had teachers volunteering to be judges and then walking you through a role play situation. And they had like the exact prep time, so it was set up the same way. And I think the fact that the students were able to go through that experience beforehand informally really helped build that confidence before the day of. So if you have the resources, I definitely recommend hosting a mock regionals if possible. After COVID,
Yeah.
of course.
That's definitely helpful. I think we did that as well. It does require a lot of planning and a lot of volunteer time from like the teachers or the students who are doing that, but I think that's really effective if it can be done.
Okay, Evelyn, Puneet, thank you so much for your time. Great presentation. Great job answering the questions. And students, great questions. Keep it up. We got 2 more workshops here today. Just a reminder to complete the Instagram story challenge and the feedback form if you guys wish to move on to ICDC. So I don't waste any more time because the next presentation will start just at 10. So you guys can leave and join the link for the next presentation. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
have a
thanks
good
for having
rest
us.
of your day, guys.
Thanks.
Yeah, feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions. I know there's a few we couldn't address in this time, but we're available on like LinkedIn or social media if you want to ask.
So do you guys have email or anything?
We can just put it in the chat.
Yeah, just throw it in the chat real quick.
Okay. Thanks.
No problem.
Thanks again for the presentation.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Evelyn, Panit, I think we're gonna end it there.
All right. Thanks so much for
Great job,
hosting and
guys.
doing all the back end stuff for us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. Have a good rest of your Saturday.
All right. Thank you.
Actually, if you don't mind, I have one quick question.
All right,
Sure.
we'll do one more.
Okay, yeah, so I basically kind of fell short of provincial this year because I chose the topic without really knowing what it was. Because like I'm customer relations. I chose business admin, and now I know I'm not good with customer relations. I didn't know that that's what it would be at that point. And now I'm kind of having trouble as to what to choose next year. But like all I know is that I'm stronger with math and stuff. So it's troubling for me.
I think some of the finance categories might be there because they're generally more technical in nature. I personally chose marketing because it was kind of more fun, in my opinion, because you can kind of make up new things, draw some things, present it that way. But if you're leaning towards more math and you didn't really like the customer service one as much, then I think the finance categories might be better suited.
I think what I would recommend is actually doing a written event because I feel that, like, let's say it wasn't your strong suit, there's a lot to learn from the written category. Like, it may be a lot more work, but I think the skills you walk away from are definitely useful as well. And it's been almost ignored in a certain sense, but definitely explore that option because I learned more from writtens personally than I did from doing cases. So look into that and just go based off your interests. Don't be too harsh on yourself because, yeah, you might have struggled with your first customer relations role play, but you don't want to judge yourself based on one experience. So just keep at it and explore different interests. And then based on that, just go with whatever you think you'd have the most fun doing.
Okay, guys, we got to cut it off
Yeah,
there.
okay.
You got to go to the next workshop. I'll see you guys there. Evelyn, Panit, have a good one.
Thanks, you too.
Bye. Thanks.